The shelter was a mess. The walls bore fresh cracks from the impact of the battle, and the floor was littered with debris, splinters of crates, scattered embers, and chunks of rock that had broken loose when Thomas's relic-enhanced punch had sent the beast crashing into the wall. The air still felt charged with the aftermath of the fight, but the real weight in the room came from something else. Lucas and Mina were gone. The fire, once the only source of warmth, was dying, flickering weakly against the cold draft that seeped through the broken entrance. The storm outside howled, a sharp, unrelenting wind pressing in on them, making the already freezing air bite even harder. Thomas stood near the entrance, fists clenched, his breath coming in short, agitated bursts. His muscles still burned from the fight, his body aching, but he barely noticed. Every second that passed was another second Mina and Lucas were missing. Every instinct in his body told him to move, to get out there and start searching before it was too late. But he was stuck. Aphyrosia was already moving, her emerald eyes scanning each of them, assessing the extent of their injuries. She stepped forward, her presence calm despite the storm raging around them. "We tend to our wounds first," she said, her voice firm. Thomas exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "We don't have time for this." "We do not have time for reckless action," Aphyrosia corrected, her gaze steady. "You will not help them if your body gives out before you even leave this shelter." He clenched his jaw, but before he could argue, she raised a hand. A soft, golden light shimmered at her fingertips, the faint glow of healing magic wrapping around her palm. "Sit," she ordered. Thomas hesitated, torn between frustration and the sharp ache radiating from his shoulder. The beast's earlier strike had left more damage than he'd let on, and the pain was growing worse. Finally, he relented. He dropped onto one of the few intact crates, rolling his shoulders stiffly. Aphyrosia placed her fingers just above his skin, the warmth of her magic seeping into his aching muscles. It wasn't a full recovery, her abilities weren't meant for deep healing, but the pain dulled, the stiffness eased. Candice sighed as she leaned against the wall, pressing a hand against her side. Blood stained the fabric where the beast's claw had grazed her, but she had no time to worry about it. "That thing nearly took my damn ribs out," she muttered. "Hold still," Aphyrosia instructed. The queen moved to Candice next, her healing light pressing against the wound just enough to stop the bleeding. Candice inhaled sharply at the sensation but didn't complain. Dira, meanwhile, was focused on Altheris. The elven warrior sat against the stone wall, his breathing measured, but the red seeping through his tunic told her everything she needed to know. "You should have said something," Dira scolded, kneeling beside him. "That's not just bruising, you're bleeding." Altheris grunted, waving a dismissive hand. "I've had worse." Dira ignored him, already reaching for her medical kit. Her hands trembled slightly, leftover adrenaline from the battle, but she forced herself to steady them. This wasn't the time for fear. She pulled out a needle and a small spool of thread. "This is going to sting," she warned, already threading the needle. Altheris said nothing, only nodding. Carefully, Dira began stitching the wound closed. The small, precise movements demanded all of her focus, keeping her from spiraling into the panic that still lingered in her chest. The scent of blood mixed with the cold air, but she pushed the discomfort aside. Aphyrosia finished with Candice and turned her attention back to Thomas. He had stayed quiet while she worked, but the way he kept clenching and unclenching his hands made it clear. His patience was running out. "You are still tense," Aphyrosia observed. "No kidding," he muttered. "Are you done? Because we should already be out there looking for them." Aphyrosia straightened, her eyes sharp. "We will, but rushing into the night blindly will only waste time. You must remain calm." Thomas scoffed. "Calm?" He stood, rolling his shoulder now that the stiffness had faded. "Lucas and Mina just disappeared in front of us, and you want me to be calm?" "We all care for them, Thomas," Aphyrosia said evenly. "But desperation clouds judgment. We will find them." He exhaled through his nose, still not convinced. Every second they waited felt like a wasted opportunity. But arguing with the queen wouldn't get him anywhere. Dira finished the last stitch on Altheris and tied it off, pressing a bandage over the wound. "That should hold," she said, forcing some confidence into her voice. Altheris gave her a nod of approval. "Efficient work." Dira leaned back, exhaling. The shelter had gone quiet again, the only sound the distant howl of the wind. They had done what they could. Now they had to move. The cold outside hit like a blade as the group stepped out of the shelter. The storm had worsened, thick snowflakes swirling wildly in the wind, cutting through their cloaks and settling in their hair. The air was heavy, the darkness unrelenting, and yet they had no choice but to press forward. Thomas was the first to move. His boots crunched against the ice-crusted ground as he pushed ahead, scanning the terrain with sharp, restless eyes. Every muscle in his body remained tense, every breath controlled and shallow. He didn't feel the cold, not really. His mind was elsewhere. On Mina, on Lucas, on whatever had just happened. There should have been something. Footprints, a mark, a sign, anything to show where they had gone. But no matter how hard he searched, there was nothing. Behind him, Candice moved carefully, scanning the ground for anything out of place. She crouched now and then, brushing a gloved hand over the frozen earth, checking for disturbances in the snow. But each time she looked up at Thomas, her face was grim. No footprints, no burn marks, no signs of a struggle. Dira wrapped her arms tightly around herself, staying close to Altheris, who moved with a steady, trained patience. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the Minulican standing there watching. "They just vanished?" she finally asked, her voice barely above the wind. Thomas ignored her. He didn't have time for questions without answers. "Something took them," Candice muttered, eyes narrowing as she studied the uneven surface of a frozen rock. "Or something erased their tracks." Thomas ground his teeth together, his frustration mounting with every step. He should have stopped it. He should have been faster, stronger, more aware. Instead, he had let them disappear right in front of him. Aphyrosia had remained quiet for much of the search, her sharp eyes drifting over the landscape, reading it differently than the others. She wasn't looking for footprints or broken twigs. She was feeling for something else. When she stopped, everyone did. The wind rushed past them, but she stood motionless, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beneath the noise. Her fingers moved through the air, tracing delicate patterns invisible to the others. Then she spoke. "The Minulican." Thomas turned sharply. "What?" Aphyrosia's gaze shifted eastward, down the mountain. "It has left." Candice frowned. "Left? What do you mean?" "It is no longer here," Aphyrosia said, her voice even, but troubled. "Its energy lingers, but faintly. It has descended toward the east." A silence settled over them. Candice exhaled, running a hand over her damp hair. "East?" Dira glanced at the others. "Isn't that toward the jungle?" Altheris gave a slow nod. "The base of the Watcher meets the wilds in that direction. If it's moving there, it either means it's wounded or it has unfinished business." Thomas clenched his fists. He didn't care about the Minulican. Not right now. "Great," he muttered. "It can go wherever the hell it wants. I'm more concerned about finding Lucas and Mina." Aphyrosia studied him carefully. "Patience," he exhaled sharply. No more waiting. If we don't find something soon—" "You will do what?" the Queen interrupted, her gaze unwavering. "Run yourself into the ground. Exhaust yourself for a search without direction. What will that accomplish?" His lips pressed into a thin line, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. She stepped closer, voice quieter. "I understand your anger, but we must think, not panic." Thomas was breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to argue, to fight against the helplessness crawling up his spine. But he knew she was right, and that made it worse. "Fine," he muttered, "but I'm not stopping." Candice sighed, rubbing warmth into her arms. "Nobody's asking you to. But without a trail, we have nothing." The cold settled around them again, the wind biting, the night stretching endlessly before them, and still, no sign of Lucas and Mina. The hours dragged on. The storm showed no signs of relenting, and though their bodies ached from battle and exhaustion, none of them could bring themselves to rest. The shelter, still damaged from the fight, barely kept out the cold. The fire had long since faded to embers, and with no one tending to it, the light flickered weakly against the stone walls. Thomas sat near the entrance, his breath visible in the frigid air, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His knee bounced impatiently, the only sign of his mounting frustration. He had scoured every inch of the terrain outside, but there was nothing. No trail, no disturbance in the snow. just the same cold, endless night stretching out before them. It felt wrong. Lucas and Mina couldn't have just disappeared. Something took them, and yet there was nothing to chase. Behind him, Candice sat with her arms crossed, tapping her fingers against her knee in quiet frustration. She had never been one to waste time standing around, but even she knew that rushing into a blizzard without direction was a fool's errand. Dira sat curled up near the remnants of the fire, her fingers tracing mindless patterns into the dust-covered floor. She felt sick. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. And worst of all, she couldn't explain it. Aphyrosia sat in still contemplation, her posture unnaturally composed. Her eyes were closed, but she wasn't asleep. She was listening, feeling for anything in the air, anything beyond what the rest of them could perceive. Altheris leaned against the wall, his injury patched, but still raw. He watched Thomas out of the corner of his eye, seeing the tension in his every movement, knowing that the boy was barely holding himself together. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then, Candice was the first to notice. She sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing toward the open entrance of the shelter. The air outside shimmered. At first, she thought it was a trick of the snow, the way light sometimes caught in the flurries, making strange shapes in the darkness. But then it grew stronger. "Wait," she murmured, pushing herself to her feet. Thomas caught it next. A flicker of something. Not quite light, not quite movement. Like a mirage against the snow. And then, just as suddenly as they had vanished, Lucas and Mina were there. Thomas was already moving before his brain fully processed it. He lunged forward, nearly slipping on the frozen ground, his heart hammering in his chest. "Mina, Lucas." The others followed, rushing out of the shelter, barely feeling the cold in their urgency. Lucas and Mina stood exactly where they had disappeared. No, not stood. They were collapsed in the snow. Thomas dropped to his knees beside them, his pulse roaring in his ears. They were motionless, their faces pale, their bodies eerily still. For a terrifying moment, he thought. But then he saw it. Their chests rising and falling. Breathing. Still alive. "They're unconscious," Candice called out, her voice sharp with concern. Aphyrosia knelt beside them, placing a hand on each of their foreheads. Her magic flickered faintly, reading their condition. "The fever is gone," she murmured, relief evident in her voice. "Their vitals are stable." Dira exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. "Then why won't they wake up?" "Something lingers in their minds," Aphyrosia said, her expression unreadable. "But they are unharmed. They will wake soon." Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, pressing a gloved hand to his forehead. They were back. But where had they been? And why did it feel like something had changed? The wind howled around them, but for the first time in hours, it no longer mattered. They had them back. That was enough, for now.